Thank you so much for joining us this week in DEI. We have our guest named Samii, and he's going to be teaching Trans 101 for the SCA, a primer. So all of the really boring disclaimers I'm going to go through very, very, very fast. So the views and opinions expressed by the panel/interview/class participants are only their current opinions and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of SCA Inc. No participant is assumed to represent any community at large. They are only speaking to their personal experiences, research, and opinions. We also have captions, which is incredibly exciting. If you are in the Zoom, you should see closed caption is available, and you can click there. You can pull up a full transcript that will appear on the right side of your page. Very exciting. We will also have captions when we upload to Facebook eventually. But now you'll be able to follow along during the class itself, where I promise I will not be speaking fast, and neither will Thane Samii. My name is Zara. I'm the SCA DEI officer. This is our weekly series. I'm going to be turning this over to Samii, and then he's going to take you through this class. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. He will be stopping periodically for questions. You can also put them into the Facebook Live, and either myself or Olivia will go ahead and pull them out and read them out. If you feel comfortable reading them, raise your hand in Zoom, not on camera, but in Zoom, or put it in the chat and we'll call on you and you can just go ahead and ask yourself. So I hope everyone enjoys. I'm going to turn it over to Samii. Take it away.
So welcome to Trans 101 for the SCA. I started creating this class about 3 years ago, but even before we get into that, I am Thane Samson Muscovich. I am one of 2 landed barons of the barony of Carrickban in the Middle Kingdom. So our tenure, I'm not really quite sure if it's a reign or a tenure or whatever it's called. It's kind of unique because we're the first 2 people of color that have sat together, and then also I'm the first trans-landed coronet for the Mid-Realm. So that's kind of cool and historic, and it's kind of cool. We have a really incredibly diverse barony. DEI is one of the things that we very strongly support, even before the office was created. But, it's one of the things that is a tenet of our barony, including just, being open and welcoming, and, that's kind of our thing. So, like I was saying, though, I started creating this class in 2017, about 3 years ago, because I saw a need for it. I saw that there was not just myself, but there were other trans and gender non-conforming individuals in the SCA who have had kind of a rocky interaction with some of our other members. So I figured, what's the best way to try and bridge that gap? Well, why not do what we love to do in the SCA and teach? So that's where this class got its start. The class was originally just an hour-long class, including all the questions that were asked. I do a lot of research, so it's substantially longer. So in addition to the DEI and SCA disclaimers, I have my own disclaimer too. This class is intended to provide a baseline of knowledge for the general public and or allies. Any person who is considering gender transition should speak to their medical and or mental health care team for further information. TLDR, I'm not a doctor. I'm not authorized to give diagnoses. Talk to your care team. So that said, we're going to get started with the basics of sex, gender, and gender identity. So defining sex and gender. So we're going to start off with the definitions of what sex is. It's going to be your basic biological assignment at birth. For lack of better terms, there are three definitions. Male, and of course these are going to be very extremely paraphrased definitions, not the clinical definitions, so keep that in mind. So you start with males. Males typically produce sperm, especially when they get later in life, and then at puberty they develop facial and body hair as secondary sex characteristics. That's one of the markers. Females typically produce eggs, and then develop breast tissue as a secondary characteristic once they hit puberty. And then there are those individuals who are intersex. So Intersex individuals often possess characteristics of both sexual of both sexes or neither. It kind of depends on how that person's chromosomes develop and how they develop in, as they're developing in the womb. Generally, intersex individuals are often assigned a gender based on genital representation at birth. They may also undergo genital reconstruction surgery shortly after birth at the will of the parents for representation of male or female. One of the things to know about that, though, is that in the last decade or so, there's been a strong push for infants to not have this surgery and to let them develop their sense of identity and autonomy naturally. Part of what I discovered is when I was doing my research for this, is that probably about 50%, roughly 50% of the cases, I don't have the article handy on me, but there is a scholarly article that basically said about 50% of those surgeries, those individuals ended up identifying as the opposite of what the parents thought. So that's one of the reasons why there's been that very strong push to say, let's just back off. Let's wait. The child's healthy. Let's let them develop their sense of identity and see how they're going to identify later in life. So we've got sex. So then what's gender? So gender is going to be your traditional social construct based on perception, or social perception rather. So you basically, generally speaking, you've got the two imposts of male and female. Males tend to be identified as strong, brave, muscular, very knightly, very strong, going, rah, 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 I'm going to handle all the things, grr. And females are typecast generally by society as being docile, quiet, doe-like, submissive, very demure, very reserved, and they're basically foils of one another. So you've got sex, you've got gender, and then there's gender identity. Gender identity is going to be that space between and including male and female. It exists on the spectrum ranging from masculine and feminine and anywhere in between, or absolutely not at all, depending on that individual's representation. Somewhere within there, you've got gender fluid. So that person's day-to-day identity fluctuates between male, female, and anywhere in between. And then you have individuals who are non-binary, and that where those people are going to their day-to-day identity includes aspects of both or neither masculine and feminine traits or roles. It really depends. Bear in mind, these are very generic terms, and the way that I'm choosing to define them to explain them. Obviously, if these definitions will depend on the person and their representation of themselves. I can't tell a person how they're going to identify. So we've got all of this. So then what is transgender? Simply stated, a person's gender identity and their physical body are out of sync. To put it into modern context, it's like if you had you have a Windows PC shell, like you have a Windows tower, but then you're running Mac on it. So that's kind of, or vice versa, or any other combination thereof. So the two are not in alignment. For example, a person can identify as masculine while having secondary sex characteristics of a female. Hi, I'm a really good example of that. Please note that transitioning is an individual experience that is unique to that person. Not everyone who identifies as transgender or gender non-conforming is able to or wishes to access appropriate clinical care. And that really depends on where they're able to, literally, like, if their medical provider is able to, or the region of wherever they're at is in, how safe it is for them. So before I move on to the SCA component of things, are there any questions on the basics?
And if folks do have questions, they can go ahead and ask in the chat. They can raise their hands, or they can ask in the Facebook Live. But we'll stop again. So
Yeah.
if you're Wellen, that's okay.
All right. So probably the part that everyone is actually here for, all the SCA stuff. So Interactions. Interactions define a lot of how we get about in the SCA. Whether it's interacting with somebody with a coronet or a crown or a circlet or nothing at all, or maybe if they've got a different other piece of regalia, whether they've got a chain on or whatnot. We rely on appearances a lot to tell us how we're going to interact with somebody, right? So one of the things to remember, specifically when dealing with trans and gender non-conforming individuals in the SCA, and just in life as well, is that they may or may not wear clothing in alignment with their gender identity. They're going to be the same people you know, love, and respect prior to their transition. One of the biggest things to remember, though, if somebody's newly out, it's often a huge display of trust for them to present as their authentic self at an event. So it kind of ties back into that whole concept of we're all chatelaines. It doesn't matter how anyone is presenting, give them the same due courtesy you would as anyone else. And also understand that, treat them no differently because they really are no different than you know them before. So one of the things that I really love about the SCA is that we're an extremely open and accepting place. We have this boundless sense of wanting to learn and wanting to share knowledge with others. Sorry if you guys hear background noise. I'm hearing my spouse's sneezing a lot off camera, so that's a thing. But anyways, the SCA is a very open and welcoming place. So we like to investigate things. We like to discover things. And that doesn't just apply to our arts and sciences projects. It also applies to our friends a lot, too. Hey, tell me about your persona. Or, hey, where are you from? I've never seen you here before. And, we develop relationships off of that. So since we like to do that, asking questions is great. Ask questions, remain open to change, and be courteous. It all comes back to those same basic things that we were taught as youth. Be kind to others and be kind to others and respect each other. So there are some things you can't ask though. So do not ask people if they have had the surgery or similar questions related to their transition. This violates U.S. patient privacy laws as well as the SCA's non-discrimination policy. So just don't do it. Don't do it. There's really nothing to that. So forms of address. So, and bear in mind, these are going to be basics. Pronouns are something that can be very unique to individuals. Ultimately, ask them. But for the sake of discussion, very basic ones. So masculine, he, him, his, right? Feminine, she, her, and hers. Pardon me. Neutral, generally speaking, they, them, and theirs. Like I said, if you're not sure about somebody's pronouns, just ask them. Honestly, like from a lot of the trans and gender non-conforming individuals that other trans and gender non-conforming individuals in my life that I've talked with, they would honestly rather you ask out of respect instead of assuming what their pronouns are, because they might have pronouns that are different than those standard 3 sets. If somebody does happen to tell you what that their pronouns are different, try to use the name of pronouns that they tell you. Again, goes back to common respect. Now, like I mentioned, some people do use pronouns that are not listed that I mentioned. If someone asks you to use a different set of pronouns, just simply try to do so. You're gonna mess up. Inevitably, especially if you've known somebody for years and years and years, and then you guys both show up to an event and, oh hi, wait, you look a little bit different, your pronouns are different. It might take a little bit of time to get that adjustment. It's a thing. Don't make a big deal out of it if you do mess up, because it's going to happen. Calling attention to that error can create a much bigger deal than it actually needs to be, and it also has the potential of endangering that trans or gender non-conforming individual. It really kind of depends on where you are, but ultimately, like I said, just make an honest attempt, and that tends to be the general accepted practice. Or, like I said, ask. If you're trying to tell a story from times past, because, we're all, some of us like to do bardic. We like to tell story, no crap, there I was stories. It's one of the foundations of the SCA, especially around the campfire. Use that subject's current gender markers and pronoun. Like I said before, misgendering that person, if you're telling a story from times past, can cause safety issues for that person. So we don't want to do that. So like I said, use that person's current gender marker and pronouns. And then that way, there's really not much that's really going to change with that story 9 times out of 10. And then going back to, if you do make a mistake, because it's going to happen, make a point of trying to use the correct pronouns going forward. So, are there any questions on that before I go into court? Nope. All right. So, for those of you who are court heralds or scribes, I've done both. I'm currently a scribe as well. So, for court, and especially too as a landed baron, that's really important for me if I'm calling somebody up for an award, or if I need to advise the crown on, hey, this is one of my populace members, this is what their pronouns are, and give them that feedback before they call that person into court. Because a lot of times, honestly, like the order of precedence may or may not be updated, or the person doing the scroll may or may not know that person. So a lot of times they will, the crowns will use their spy network, so to speak, of their landed nobility to give them that information. So, but anyways, if you're doing court, use the pronouns or form of address that most closely aligns with the person's gender identity. Pretty simple, right? One of the things that is kind of cool is that in 2018, the College of Heralds and the SCA approved gender-neutral forms of address for scrolls and in court. So those 3 forms are going to be armiger, noble, and noblesse. So noblesse is actually a newer one that Zara actually, told me about a couple months ago. The original 3rd one was gentle, but I guess yeah, they basically decided that it was too common and doesn't really fit. So noblesse is a little bit of ring to it. It rolls off the tongue a little bit, so it works for the heralds, and it's just that nice little pop of, ooh, I get to be a little fancy. So, like I mentioned earlier, I'm from the Middle Kingdom, so I know all of our policies and procedures. So bear that in mind about the next part I'm going to mention. So, at least in my kingdom, which is the Middle Kingdom, we're excellent at providing the populace with the opportunity to have the order of precedence updated, and also requesting updated scrolls created with the person's new SCA name and gender. So I also know that several other kingdoms do that. I know that North Shield does it pretty easily. The West does it. Edenvelt's pretty easy as well. And a lot of the other kingdoms are starting to move towards that as well. So you usually contact your order of precedence clerk if you were going to do so. And then it depends on that kingdom too. Like, I know that several kingdoms are starting to go to more self-managed for populace database or populace profiles. So it kind of depends on what your kingdom is able to do, or what your kingdom's services are, so to speak. But updated scrolls, you're generally going to contact your backlog signet or your kingdom signet. 19 of the 20 kingdoms have a backlog signet. And on my website, which we can provide later, I've got a list. Actually, we'll provide that later because I've got to update my notes. But in the back of it is a listing of all of the order of precedent. Kingdom signets. I think I have the precedence clerks, and then the backlog signets if there is one available for a kingdom. So you can contact them if you do need to have your paperwork updated. For the Middle Kingdom, at least, there's a limit of 2 to 3 years prior for requests to get an updated scroll. So there's that. The other option you have is you can contact a scribe on your own. More than likely, you're probably not going to have signatures on it, and you're probably not going to have a seal on it if your kingdom does that. But it's still another option where if you want to have that piece recreated, or if you want to have a completely new piece done with your correct gender identity and pronouns used, or correct name and pronouns used, that's another option you have as well. And like I said, many of the Society's kingdoms offer services to their populace for this. You just need to reach out to them and ask. The kingdom's precedence clerks and it is the precedence clerks and the backlog signets that I have the contact information for. But you can also contact the kingdom signets as well for that information if you need to get your stuff updated. So that's what I've got for SCA related stuff before we dig into history. Are there any questions?
I think we're good. It's okay if people want to hold their questions to the end. We're going to have enough time to get to everyone. So if you're just kind of like taking notes and thinking, that's totally fine.
I'm also trying to slow down a little bit too, because that's the thing, because I don't want to go too fast for the captioning. So history.
Gender neutral version to Lord and Lady. So that, yeah, I'll let him talk about that.
So gender neutral for Lord and Lady are going to be armiger, noble, and noblesse. So that's going to be your AOA level. Or are you talking about like the generic lowercase L or lowercase? I don't really know. I would just honestly use their name. I honestly don't see a lot of people using the lowercase L when regarding somebody. Like, I really don't see that often. Like, usually it would just be, you'd call them by their name, or if you just call them by their name. I've also heard some people use cousin as well.
Gentle would be a good one for that one.
Yeah, gentle would be also very good for that. Okay. So the other thing too that I failed to mention, I realized that, is so all of those titles, those alternative titles I mentioned, are for the AOA, the Award of Arms level. For the Grant of Arms, you would use honorable or honored. So honored armiger, or honorable armiger, honored noble, honorable noble, honored noblesse, which, or honorable noblesse. So it's just basically, you're adding that honored or honorable or honored component to that, because that's that next level of the grant. For the Patent of Arms, I'm not quite sure. There's a lot of different ones that are available, actually, that are broken down by language. So on the College of Heralds website, there's a listing of a bunch of different alternative titles. Research that too. There are several languages that have gender neutral options that might actually fit better for your personal persona. So there are options. So if there's no other questions about titles or court, I'm going to move on to history. Thank you, Olivia. For those of you who are in the Zoom chat, and I'm not sure if she's going to post to Facebook, Olivia. Okay, so on the Facebook chat and also on Facebook and also in the Zoom chat, there's a link to the heraldry titles. So if you want to look at those alternative titles, Olivia provided those for us. Thank you, Olivia. All right, so history. So until the late 1800s or early 1900s, it's basically that Industrial Revolution era where we started to see a lot of scientific and technological advancements. There was no clear definition of what defines being transgender. Honestly, the term and definition did not exist until the late 1800s. Pardon me. And it was it actually stems from organic chemistry. So trans being different, two different atoms, pardon me, and cis being the same. And we'll get into that a little bit later, specifically with cis in relation to the history of cisgender and why it's being used. So early scientists define being transgender, especially when you get into modern science, define being transgender or gender non-conforming as being mentally ill. That has, of course, changed modernly, but for the sake of understanding what was going on in period and even a little bit after period, post SCA period, it's important to understand what those concepts, and what those, how the world viewed, people who were a little bit different. So as far as the research and history, there's few to no notes or documents stating the reasons why someone may have lived as the opposite gender or as an iteration of non-binary gender presentation during the period the SCA covers. For the sake of my research, it's going to be everything pre-1650 Common Era. I know right now they're currently redefining and discussing what the official end date is. That's what I use for my definition, for my research. So various cultures have different gender expressions and just accepted people as they are. It kind of depends on where you are in the world. And like I said, we'll have different examples of, you'll actually see that throughout, like, the history of trans and gender non-conforming people in the world. Modern history is often viewed through the lenses of Christianity and colonialism, so it makes it very difficult to decipher the intent of those who lived in period, especially for those cultures outside the spectrum of Christianity. So when I mention the spectrum of Christianity, I'm not just talking about the European definition of Christianity, so the Anglo-based, but it's also it's basically the three primary religions. So Christianity as we know it today, Judaism, and then also Islam. So all three of them have very similar. Yes, the Abrahamic religions. Thank you. Terminology is hard tonight. So the Abrahamic religions, outside of them, there's very different views on how gender is applied. So I have specific criteria for my additions for this class. My personal criteria for this is that the person lived for a substantial time in their life and or self-identified as a gender identity that is not what they were born as. For example, Hatshepsut / Maat Kare, and then Eleanor, who we will both discuss later on. Or the culture, religion, or person has documented the presence of a trans or gender non-conforming individual in their time period, independent of a specific named person. For example, Christianity Pizan, and then Kalonymus Ben Kalonymus. So those are kind of my criteria for why I include things. Another thing to mention, though, too, is that this is a living document for me. So the notes that I actually have up on my other screen, this is a living document. It's constantly evolving. I'm constantly doing research. I'm constantly adding more things to it. So like I said earlier, this class was originally 1 hour. This, arguably, with questions and everything added, goes about an hour to an hour and a half now, depending on how fast I talk and all of that fun stuff. So let's take a walk down memory trail, shall we? So we're going to start in 1460 before Common Era with Hatshepsut. So Hatshepsut was one of the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty in Egypt. So very, very far back, ancient Egyptian history. So Hatshepsut was originally married to their half-brother, because Egyptian lineages are really weird, first and foremost. They're really, really weird lineages. They believe very strongly in the purity of the bloodline, so you have a lot of intermarrying. But that's not entirely relevant, but it kind of is. Anyways, though, so Hatshepsut became regent when their husband, like I mentioned, half-brother, died. They acted as regent and then were named pharaoh because their son/nephew, again, remember that Egyptian lineages are really weird with the bloodlines, was too young to reign. In 1473, Hatshepsut adopted kingly male titles and took on the masculine name of Maat Kare. So this is going to be 7 years into 15 of being co-regent with their son/nephew. We're going to say the son for right now, or we're going to say son for this because that's basically how that lineage worked. So in the process of Hatshepsut adopting those kingly roles and adopting that title, or adopting that role, they built a second tomb befitting a king rather than just keeping the one that was built while they were queen. So when Hatshepsut's spouse, or when their husband was originally alive, they originally had a tomb built for them. He's like, here's your queen tomb. It's kind of small, but it's still lavish, because for as patriarchal as Egyptian society and culture was then, and even is now, they still looked very highly upon their queens. they very much believed in lavish them with all of the the gold and jewels and all the things that they deserved. So she had a pretty decent sized tomb, and then adopted those kingly and masculine titles, and said, "Again, no, I'm king now. I'm going to build a bigger one." So did absolutely that. One of the things that's kind of really fascinating about Hatshepsut is that there's lots of different iconography that has interspersed pronouns. Really, really fascinating about that. So I actually have a book right now because I recently was doing research, like I mentioned, specifically about the Hatshepsut finds and also about their history. So, but anyway, so there's icons that have inscriptions using both masculine and feminine titles and names. So Hatshepsut's full title, from a sarcophagus that was discovered in 1904 in the Valley of the Kings. So the sarcophagus was built by Hatshepsut for their father, and the title was from that sarcophagus, where it was a dedication to their father. Was May the Horus Waset, or Wasret Kau, which is powerful of cause, Tules Wajat Rinput, green of years, Golden Horus Netjeret Kau, divine of appearances, live. The king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Ma'at Kare, son of Re, Hatshepsut united with the moon, may she live forever. In that big old that big old paragraph, you have interspersing self-references to both masculine and feminine references to Hatshepsut. And that was something that Hatshepsut told whoever was doing the carving for the sarcophagus, "I want this on here." And I have theories about this personally, about why that is. I personally believe, so since, again, part of this is research and hypotheses, which are fun, I actually believe because of the interspersing identification, Hatshepsut might actually be the first non-binary or genderqueer individual known in history. Nothing has been confirmed, though, because when all this documentation was written, there wasn't really a definition. The book, in fact, that I have from the library that was published by the Met Museum was from the 70s. There wasn't any of this terminology about gender nonconformance and non-binary and genderqueer then. That's all super, super recent terminology. So, but as I've been doing the research, I'm going, wait a minute. This isn't just someone that identified as, possibly identified as transmasculine. This is somebody that they had this interspersing going back and forth, and it's not just one or two times. It's consistent, as you see it. It's consistently done throughout references to them throughout history, throughout their history and the documentation. Bearing in mind, of course, that hieroglyphs can only tell us so much, and there's definitely some margin for error. Given all of that, it's still something that it's a plausibility. But anyway, so in terms of Hatshepsut, the person, there are a lot of icons that were created depicting the pharaoh as male with a fake gold beard. There are a lot of them also where Hatshepsut is depicted wearing the two crowns of Egypt, for the upper and lower, which is something that was specifically reserved for masculine rulers. Hatshepsut also, when out and about and addressing their populace, often wore a detachable beard and male regalia. They were also the first pharaoh to name himself a semi-divine while alive, because this was, again, Egypt is weird. Egypt is unique. Not so much weird, but they're very unique about things. And specifically, the semi-divine thing didn't occur until Hatshepsut and then the lineage following them. In theory, the identifying as with the masculine titles might have been done for political reasons. I'm honestly not quite sure now. Again, this is research is evolving. I'm finding out more information. From one of the scholarly articles, though, that I had read as part of the research, I found that, as part of when Hatshepsut was becoming that regent, Hatshepsut also took a new name, Ma'at Kare, sometimes translated as truth. Ma'at is the soul, Ka, of the sun god, Re. The keyword here is Ma'at, the ancient Egyptian expression for order and justice as established by the gods. Maintaining and perpetuating Ma'at to ensure the prosperity and stability of the country required a legitimate pharaoh who could speak, as only pharaohs could, directly with the gods. By calling herself Ma'at Kare, Hatshepsut was likely reassuring her people that they had a legitimate ruler on the throne. That is, like I said, is possibly done for political reasons, but it was something that there came a point during the Regency reign where Hatshepsut was co-reigning with their son. So, maybe not. Only more research will tell. So, we're going to move up about 1,000 years to the Torah and the Jewish religion, to 450 before Common Era. Okay, so there's a question that I noticed about the pronouns. They noticed that I was using she and also they when referring to this figure. Do I have pronouns that I've settled on, or do you switch as they seem to have done? I'm trying to primarily use they when referring to Hatshepsut until I confirm one way or the other whether they were non-binary or transmasculine, or possibly identifying as transmasculine. I'm trying to be as respectful, even in death, to that person. So that's why I'm using they. The use of she specifically is referring to the quotation. I'm trying, like, me personally, I'm kind of flubbing too. Like, as I mentioned earlier, like, if you mess up, just keep rolling. But generally speaking, I'm trying to use they when referring to Hatshepsut because I'm really not sure what their gender identity was when they died. I'm legitimately not sure. I'm still doing more research on that. So, which is probably going to be its whole nother thing entirely. But it's just trying to be respectful to them even in death. So, like I said, moving forward to 450 before Common Era to the Torah and the Jewish religion. So the Torah and the Jewish religion denote 6 genders, which is really fascinating. And we're going to go through all of them and their definitions as I found them. So the first one is Zahar, and I apologize for if I'm butchering the Hebrew because I'm not a native Hebrew speaker. I'm trying to pronounce them the best I know. So the first one is Zahar. This term is derived from the word for a pointy sword and refers to a phallus. And it's typically going to be male in English. Then there's Nakiva. This term is derived from the word for a crevice and possibly refers to a vaginal opening. It is usually translated as female in English. Then there's androgynos, which comes from Greek. It's a person who has both male and female sexual characteristics. There are 149 references in the Mishnah and the Talmud. So the Mishnah and the Talmud, and then also the Midrash and Jewish law codes, are basically all lessons for life, essentially, and guidelines for this is how you should live your life. So very important and integrated into explaining the Torah. So, like I said, there's 149 references in the Mishnah and the Talmud, which was written sometime between the 1st and the 8th centuries Common Era, so a little bit later, like I said, to explain the Torah. And then there are 350 in classical Midrash and Jewish law codes. So those were documented between the 2nd and 16th centuries Common Era. So again, explaining all the things in the Torah. Here's how we explain these things. So yeah. The fourth is Tumtum, and that's a person whose sexual characteristics are indeterminate or obscured, which is going to be your non-binary individual. For modern English, androgynous obviously is going to be your genderqueer individual who is, or gender fluid, who's very, very flexible and, yeah. But Tum Tum, though, is a person whose sexual characteristics are indeterminate or obscured. There are 181 references in the Mishnah and the Talmud, 335 in the classical Midrash and Jewish law codes. The fifth is Alonit. That's a person who is identified as female at birth, but develops male characteristics at puberty and is infertile. There are 80 references in the Mishnah and the Talmud, and then 40 in the classical Midrash and Jewish law codes. That's going to be your person who is essentially transmasculine. So that's pretty easily defined. And then the last is Sadis. So a Sadis is a person who is identified as male at birth, but develops female characteristics at puberty and or is lacking a penis. A Sadis can be naturally a Sadis, just Sadis Hama, or become one through human intervention, Sadis Adam. And then for that, that's going to be essentially someone who is transfeminine, or transitioning from male to female. There are 156 references in the Mishnah and the Talmud, and 379 in classical Midrash and Jewish law codes. So, yeah, there's a bunch of references to individuals who are explicitly gender non-conforming and not just stuck to the binary of masculine or feminine in the Torah, in the Jewish religion. Which is absolutely fascinating to me because most of the Abrahamic religions don't really discuss that too much. But Judaism's like, meh, we're going to discuss this and we're going to go full tilt into it, which is awesome. So we're going to bump across to Asia to 400 and also a little bit further, closer in time, to 400 before Common Era and discuss the Hijra community very briefly. The Hijra community is first mentioned in the Kama Sutra, and which was written as early as 400 before Common Era. Now, the Kama Sutra, if you are not familiar, is not just the reference guide to really interesting intimate positions. It is actually a religious text. So, and there's a lot of things that are involved in that, and ways of living that are very holistic and very in tune with not just nature but also humankind. So, big religious text. But the Hijra can be eunuchs, intersex, or transgender, and they've been part of South Asia's culture for thousands of years, as documented. Eunuchs are celebrated in sacred Hindu texts such as the Mahabharata and the Kama Sutra, and they also enjoyed influential positions in the Mughal courts. Typically, those individuals were going to be courtesans and serve in different capacities, whether they were companions to the higher-ups in the Mughal courts, or, hey, they've got a lot of connections in their community, so they served as not quite, but also kind of like guides or diplomats almost. Not a little bit different, but so there's that. So then we're going to jump across now to Common Era, so past that 0 marker, and we're going to go to 203 Common Era, to Elagabalus or Heliogabalus, as they prefer to be called, or she preferred to be called, rather. So Elagabalus was a Roman emperor who was born male, and then chose to live as female and chose the title of empress during her reign. Elagabalus was known to frequently wear cosmetics and dress as female. She also was known to solicit physicians who could provide her with surgery to give her female genitalia. It is unconfirmed whether she was successful in her solicitations. I've not been able to confirm it one way or the other, but that was something that she absolutely sought after. Something that's kind of notable about that is that, note the date, 203 Common Era. A lot of the information that is passed around commonly is that gender reassignment or gender confirmation surgeries are something that is new. They aren't. This is something that's been practiced for millennia. Now, bear in mind, the science and the technology to do them has been greatly advanced. But, but this is not, what's old is new again, or what's old is new again, essentially. I'm seeing some of the commentary in the chat and from here. So I'm actually going to pause for a moment too, because I noticed that somebody that Don Edmondson mentioned that in Central Asia there are the Inaris from Scythian culture. So in the scope of my research, I am just at the very tip of the iceberg. I have not. I've done a lot of research, all things considered, but there's still I have source material on my laptop that I haven't even touched yet, between work obligations and school. But yeah, just the tip of the iceberg, and I know that there are hundreds of thousands of documents out there and hundreds of thousands of examples out there that I haven't even seen yet, and I'm kind of looking forward to getting into them too once I graduate. So, Elagabalus, solicited physicians. All right, so we're going to keep moving forward in history to 567, St. Anastasia the Patrician. So, St. Anastasia the Patrician, and why I mention them, and again, going back to my criteria of why I mention people, so St. Anastasia the Patrician was someone who identified as female, but lived part of their life and was accorded burial rights as a male monk in seclusion from most people. So here's what happened. Here's what happened with that. So Saint Anastasia was betrothed to some French noble. I can't even entirely remember off the top of my head what level of nobility they were, who was kind of an abusive jerk. Anastasia was also very heavily devoted to the Bible and to studying Christianity. Well, 567, women weren't really allowed to work with the texts. They really couldn't, they weren't really allowed to do any of the reading. They weren't really allowed to handle them. It was, okay, you're going to go to church, but yet, the fathers, the pastors or whatever, or whatnot, the church leaders are going to tell you what you need to know. So, Anastasia kind of went and said, well, this is not exactly conducive to my life. This is not me living my best life at all. So what she did is she approached the Father Abbot of a local abbey and said, Father, I have this problem. How can we make this problem go away? Father Abbot said, well, get rid, to break the betrothal, you have to, and to come into the abbey, here's what we're going to do for you. You see that hill up there that's secluded, this mountainside that's secluded? We're going to have you sit up there in seclusion. Now, I have one trusted brother. He's going to bring you reading material. He'll bring you your food and water. But all the other brothers down here at the Abbey, all they're going to know is that you have decided to dedicate your life to Christ and the study of Christianity. So we're going to let you stay up there. And then all they're going to know is that there's just another brother that has decided to stay in seclusion because of this. So that's how that was. So Anastasia lived there until they died. And I don't know if it was that same father or if it was one that was after him. But so Anastasia died in seclusion. And there was only one or two people in the entire abbey that knew what was going on. Everyone else just knew that there was a super pious brother that was up here devoting their life to the good word and the research and the understanding of what the good Lord said. That's all they knew. So Anastasia dies. Pardon me. The father sends a letter to the Pope. Pope reads the letter. Okay. This is an incredible thing. We're going to canonize this person. So Anastasia gets canonized. Hence, Saint Anastasia the Patrician. Like I mentioned, Anastasia is mentioned because of the fact that she Saint Anastasia, chose to live as male and chose to identify as male to maintain, basically to escape the really abusive the really abusive betrothed, but also to pursue this life of godliness that she wanted, that she couldn't do unless she identified as male. Gave up all of her worldly possessions, said, "Nope, I'm good with that," and gave up her identity and self. So that's one of the reasons why I have her included, because it's a really unique thing, and it's not something you actually see very commonly, especially that early. Yeah, especially that early, that soon after the turn of the millennia. You don't see that very often. So that was a thing. So we're going to bump up about 750 years to 1322. Colonimus Ben Colonimus. Colonimus Ben Colonimus, pardon me, was a Jewish theorist and, wow, I am definitely forgetting my brain, religious scholar. So he wrote Evan Bohan, which is a poem which discusses transitioning and being gender variant, gender queer. So here is the poem. So this was, like I said, this was written in 1322. It has been transcribed modernly by a rabbi. It's translated by Rabbi Stephen Greenberg. What an awful fate for my mother that she bore a son. What a loss of all benefit. Cursed be the one who announced to my father, "It's a boy!" Woe to him who has male sons. Upon them a heavy yoke has been placed, restrictions and constraints, some in private, some in public, some to avoid the mere appearance of violation, and some entering the most secret of places. Strong statutes and awesome commandments. 613. Who is the man who can do all that is written, so that he might be spared? Oh, but had the artisan who made me created me instead, a fair woman. Today I would be wise and insightful. We would weave, my friends and I, and in the moonlight spin our yarn, and tell our stories to one another, from dusk till midnight. We'd tell of the events of our day, silly things, matters of no consequence. But also I would grow very wise from the spinning, and I would say, happy is she who knows how to work with combed flax and weave it into fine white linen. And at times, in the way of women, I would lie down on the kitchen floor, between the ovens, turn the coals, and taste the different dishes. On holidays I would put on my best jewelry. I would beat on the drum, and my clapping hands would ring. And when I was ready and the time was right, an excellent youth would be my fortune. He would love me, place me on a pedestal, dress me in jewels of gold, earrings, bracelets, necklaces, and on the appointed day, in the season of joy when brides are wed, for 7 days would the boy increase my delight and gladness. Were I hungry, he would feed me well-kneaded bread. Were I thirsty, he would quench me with light and dark wine. He would not chastise me, nor harshly treat me, and my pleasure he would not diminish. Every Sabbath and each new moon, his head he would rest upon my breast. The 3 husbandly duties he would fulfill: rations, raiment, and regular intimacy. And 3 wifely duties would I also fulfill: blood, lights, and bread. Father in heaven, who did miracles for our ancestors with fire and water, you changed the fire of Chaldee so it would not burn hot. You changed Dinah in the womb of her mother to a girl. You changed the staff to a snake before 1,000,000 eyes. You changed hand to white, and the sea to dry land. In the desert you turned rock to water, hard flint to fountain. Who would then turn me from a man to a woman? Were I only to have merited this, being so graced by your goodness? What shall I say? Why cry or be bitter? If my Father in heaven has decreed upon me, and has made me with an immutable deformity, and then I do not wish to remove it. And the sorrow of the impossible is a human pain that nothing will cure, and for which no comfort can be found. So I will bear and suffer until I die and wither on the ground. And since I have learned from the tradition that we bless both the good and the bitter, I will bless in the voice, hushed and weak. Blessed are you, O Lord, who has not made me a woman. So that poem was written in 1322, which, so the 1300s, we're starting to see the beginning of the Crusades, or actually, no, we have already had the Crusades at that point. We're starting to see the Inquisition, and it doesn't matter where you look at it, like, the Inquisition's a thing, not just for Christianity, but also, like we said, for the Abrahamic religions. They're all starting to take a really hard look at what they're saying. So we have the scholar who's like, yeah, no, here's this. And you've got this poem that's essentially talking about being trans feminine and having these desires and fighting these urges and going, Lord, why have you cursed me in this way? And just running through all those various things in one's head and pondering all of these things. So it's a very, very, very unique poem to be a primary period resource. It's, like I said, to me, it's really exciting. I love it. So still kind of in that same general time zone, 1354. We're also going to jump across over to Italy. So you have Rolandina Roncaglia. Rolandina was a prostitute who identified as a woman. She was born male and had very feminine features, even prior to identifying as female full time. It was said, it was actually said during the law proceedings, because there's primary source documents where the documents were scanned in and then translated, which is still really cool. And he continually frequented the prostitutes of Rialto in bed and going to the public baths with them. And meanwhile, he hid his member on both sides so that no one ever noticed, and they all very clearly considered him a female. Rolandina was prosecuted as a prostitute by the Lord Doge in Venice and condemned to be burned. She did not recant her statement of identity even when faced with death, because, like I said, this is smack dab in the middle of the Inquisition. One of the ways that someone could escape death by burning or escape death is by recanting their identity and essentially giving up the ruse, so to speak, which makes me personally cringe, but it was that very patriarchal, very binary way of looking at the world at that point. And for someone who, faced by death, was basically going, nah, bro, this is me. Like, this is me, take me as I am. That's an act, a very strong act of defiance, but it's also an act of courage. And it also speaks very much to that individual's sense of self. That this is who I am, this is how I see me, you can't take that away from me. That's huge. And it's insanely notable, which is, of course, why it's in here. Still in Italy, kind of bordering into France, we've got Christine de Pizan. Christine de Pizan was a Venetian who was a poet and author at the court of King Charles VI of France. She, of course, was born in Venice, moved to France when she became a patron of the court, or when the French court became, when King Charles VI said, hey, I'm going to pay for you to live here and do your theory and all of that. Like I said, terminology is not working tonight for me. So in 1405, during part of this time where she lived in France, Christine de Pizan wrote the Book of Three Virtues. So in this book, she theorized that souls have no gender, but instead inhabit masculine or feminine forms based on the will of God. The book also argued that the souls of masculine and feminine individuals are created in God's image and are equal to one another in all things. Christine de Pizan also theorized that a person's gender can change by will of the Spirit in accordance with the will of God. Specifically from the Book of Three Virtues, the composition of one's body is arranged so as to reflect the gendered form in conformity with one's gendered offices. If the duties change, the essence has to change, which means that the constituents have to be arranged. What that basically talks about is, so let's say that we've got very portly man who's in France or Italy, kind of depends on where you're at, or somewhere in Europe, and they're basically fighting the status quo because they like to knit. They like to knit, or they like to do the housework that is traditionally, quote, seen as women's work. I use that very loosely because class. So one of the things, and I've lost my train of thought. So I'm sorry. Example. So, you have this person who is traditionally very masculine, and they're doing things that are, quote, traditionally feminine. According to Bazan's theory, basically, one, this is in the image of the maker. It's in the image of God that this person is doing this. But also, two, if this is truly how that person feels and believes that by extension, they should also, by extension, they're also doing these things because they're in much more tune with like their feminine side, so to speak. And terminology is weird, but they're exhibiting some of these feminine attributes. Maybe they should also have everything else in alignment with this, or maybe they weren't supposed to be masculine, or anywhere really in that anywhere in that spectrum, really. So basically, the whole theory is, one, trans people are valid and are made in the form of what God wants. So we exist for a reason, and we are just like everyone else. We are made in God's image. That's basically the theory that says that. That's the book that says that. 1395, we have John Reichner called Eleanor, which I mentioned earlier. Eleanor, so Reichner was called into court and called herself Eleanor when called into court for prostitution. She maintained that identity. So she may have actually not been charged for the crime as a way of not acknowledging her gender identity. I have read multiple conflicting reports about that. One that she was threatened with death, and then one saying that, and then a couple of them saying that they just didn't do anything at the court case and said, go do your thing, just don't cause any harm. And they dismissed the charges as a way of not acknowledging the fact that she was identifying as female. So what's also really notable about her is that she worked as a seamstress for 5 weeks prior to the Feast of St. Michael's. So St. Michael is the patron saint of protectors, if you're not familiar. And in England, huge, huge deal. The Archangel Michael, really, really big deal. It's a really big feast day in that particular time period. And even now, today, even currently, it's kind of a big deal too. The other thing that's really fascinating about Eleanor is that she had a community surrounding her during her transition. So she basically said, "Hey, I want to identify as female. This is who I am." And she reached out to her community, and like they're all like, "Yeah, we got you. Here's how you do your makeup. Here's how you do your hair. And here's some clothing. And we're going to teach you these skills so you can get a job as a woman," which is literally how she became a seamstress, because she had to completely relearn a new set of skills. And she was equipped to do it and essentially fit into her new role as a woman, with the community surrounding her and supporting her in that identity. Again, this is during the time of the Inquisition. That's nearly unheard of, especially having that huge community surrounding you. That's really cool that like you see that, because we see it now modernly, where you have the trans and gender non-conforming community who we literally take our newer individuals who are starting their transition journey or starting their gender exploration, and we say, hey, let me help you out with that binder, or let me help you out with getting breast forms, or let me help you out with figuring out clothing and makeup and hair that fits you, the individual. So to see that, documented in history so early is so cool. Again, what's there's nothing. As someone else said, there's nothing new under the sun. And then the final reference I have is actually from here in America, which is kind of unique and everything. And like I said, all this research, tip of the iceberg, I'm still digging. 1629 as Thomasine Hall. So she lived in colonial Virginia, was possibly intersexed, pardon me, was possibly identified as intersex. Pardon me. And then testified in court that he was both a man and a woman. And like literally pulled that straight out of the documentation from the court case. So that individual identified, say, hey, yeah, this is who I am. So that's the history component. There's a couple other things just before we wrap up. So the use of cis in reference to gender. As I mentioned earlier, it was it was originally in the 1880s as a way to describe chemical bonds, organic chemical bonds specifically, where you have the two bonds that are the same, so they are cis, or you have ones that are trans, which are different bonds, or bonds between two different chemicals. Cis was adopted. The prefix cis was adopted by the LGBT community as a way to describe non-trans individuals in 1994. It's a very, very recent term. And then it was actually not originally intended as a pejorative term. It was originally only intended to be used as a descriptor. I put it in here specifically because language, as we've watched, evolves. Not more than 5 to 7 years ago, cisgender, both those terms were used as negative terms, pejorative terms used to describe someone who is not a trans or gender non-conforming individual. Language changes, language evolves. Now at this point, we're back to the original description, which is it's just a descriptor. It's not meant to put you down. So that's the thing. And the final thing I've got, gender identity and sexual orientation. They're not mutually exclusive. One's attraction to another is independent of their gender identity. They are not dependent upon one another. And then the terms for someone may change if a person transitions and their attractions remain the same. For example, a person who identifies initially as a straight male prior to transitioning would identify as a lesbian when their gender identity transitions to female. Again, kind of using the binary as that basis, but it's an example. Like gender identity, sexual orientation, of course, is on a spectrum. Sexual orientation can and does shift for some people as they become more self-realized and become more comfortable with themselves. So that's all I have for everyone. I open the floor up for questions if anyone's got any.
All right, thank you. I think we've got several people looking for resources for further reading, copies of your research or anything else. I'm going to read one that says, I would love a copy of your research. I want my small tribe here to perhaps come play in the SCA. My trans son is looking forward to coming back and bringing his trans boyfriend back with him.
Oh, excellent.
So important to teach. Thank you for having this class. So yeah, I think a lot of people would be interested in the research and everything else. If you can tell them where they can find that.
So the research is on my website, SamiiTiger.com. So SAMII Tiger.com. And then if you go over to SCA and then drop down to Trans 101 for the SCA. I've got my research. I don't have the most current edition of the notes because I'm still, doing additional polishing and addition. Like I said, it's a living document. I do update it. There's no consistent timeline on when I update it, but there is but I try to update it fairly reasonably, like whenever I have something big. So I'm actually due for another update, especially with all of the information about hot chipset in there. Like I've got to put that up in there, so that that's the most current thing. And I do maintain a works cited page with that because if people want to read more, they're more than welcome to. But I pull out the stuff that's relevant specifically to this class. There's a lot of information out there. There's actually a medieval journal that I still haven't gone all the way through. It's where I found the information on Thomasine Hall, in fact. that centered specifically on women and gender non-conforming individuals in history, which was really, really cool. And like I said, I'm still deep diving into all of it to get further information. With me being what is it called? Let me go to my notes. Crap. I don't remember off the top of my head. Oh, Medieval Feminist Forum is one of them. So the Medieval Feminist Forum, I don't actually have that one listed right now. So that's another thing I've got to do is I need to go and update some of my stuff, because evidently I have not added all of my resources, and I need to do that. So I'm probably looking the next few weeks. Like winter break for me is happening. Thank you, Olivia, because yeah, it's basically an entire thing. But yeah, the Medieval Feminist Forum is really fantastic, and it's not just about one thing; it's about multiple things. Where like there's a whole there was a whole issue that came out, but there's so many different articles that I haven't gotten a chance to read yet because I work full time and I'm a part-time student right now. So a lot of my this is research that I do in my spare time, usually during breaks. So.
You have another question. What are you studying at university? History and gender?
I'm not actually. So, my officially declared major is I'm a general studies major, but I have centered a lot of my classes on emergency response and management.
Okay, and then if anyone has any other questions before we wrap up, definitely drop them in the Zoom chat or the Facebook Live chat, or raise your hand on Zoom. Or at this point, I suppose you can just kind of wave at the camera and we can see you.
Wave at the camera, speak up. I mean,
I do want to thank you so much for teaching, Samii, and I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. Oh, Vered, go ahead.
Hi. So I love dancing. Dancing is great. I find that when I go to conventions, a lot of times when they call roles for the dancing, they say larks and ravens. And when I go to dancing events in the SCA, at least as recently as I recall going to dancing events in the SCA, they call the roles for lord and lady. And I would love to, like, I don't know if this is specifically a question, but I would just like to state for the record that it would be great if we could bring the Middle Ages into the 21st century, in terms of having non-binary, non-gendered calls for dancing roles. And if anybody has any specific suggestions, then I guess that's a question.
Yeah, I personally don't have any thus far. So I know that that is one of the challenges that the SCA faces, though, is that we're constantly trying to evolve our language so it's more inclusive. So a little bit about me in the SCA too that I probably should have mentioned earlier. I'm a fighter. So, for example, the language surrounding personal protection, getting talking with specifically like my Kingdom Knight Marshal and going, hey, can we possibly make this more gender neutral? Because with the way that the rules are written, half the rules apply to me in one fashion, half of them don't apply to me in the other fashion because I'm transmasculine. So it's like, where's that, where's that thing? Olivia has a suggestion of using partner A and partner B. Problem is that when you have not just partnered dances, that gets a little finicky. Or maybe, I don't know, just using dancers to the floor, or lead and follower. I don't know, leader follower, like that's pretty. I don't know. Yeah, leads and follows. Like I've heard that used as well. Moon and sun. Ooh, that's a unique one. It's still mildly gendered though, but there's a whole nother thing that can be dissected with that and the use of language. Right. Would all good gentles who wish to dance please come to the floor? I think specifically they're Vera, you can always correct me on this, but I believe you're specifically looking for those who are, in terms of leading and following in the dances, like who needs to come out.
Yeah, so the different roles in the dance, so they're gendered. It's all based on what is the role that a man would have in this dance, what is the role that a woman would have in this dance, based on historical context and historical gender roles and all of that. And how do we adapt that so that it's still descriptive and useful, so I know which role respective in the dance I'm signing up for when I say, oh yeah, I'll take Lark or I'll be Raven this time.
Yeah, I mean, even the Lark and Raven is still really gendered too. I mean, I like it, but it's specifically it's gendered, and because I kind of saw that whole because of the size of the birds. Ravens are traditionally more masculine. Larks are more, kind of going back absolutely to when I mentioned about the gender roles and gender terms between feminine and masculine. It's a whole which one's bigger, which one's smaller, and that's it's a whole deep diving into that context. Mona?
Okay. I don't see any other questions at this point. So again, thank you for teaching, and thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. If you have further questions, you can get a hold of Samii through his website. Oh, do we have one more question? Mana, did you? Okay, we're good. Thank you. So you can get a hold of him through his website. You can also reach out to me and I can put you in touch with him. If you have any general questions about DEI, you can reach out to me at equity@sca.org. Samii, do you want to close with anything?
No, just thank you for your... okay. My apologies. Sorry in the comment thing. Thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure spending this evening with you all. I appreciate the questions that you all brought as well. And, have a great rest of the week.
All right, thank you. Have a good night, everybody.